Arsenal extend their lead over their title rivals at the top of the table, but that was a win that Arteta and Arsenal will probably want to forget quite quickly. It's a win where Arsenal once again got their noses in front and didn't give next to anything away, and it was a win where we found ourselves up against this incredibly well drilled and stubborn Palace 5-4-1 mid-block, and for me it was a win for Arsenal that reminds us that sometimes intentions and execution don't always align, but it's probably another win that we as Arsenal fans have wanted more of, a win where we don't actually feel as good a value for it. Welcome back to the Harvey Gratian YouTube channel. I'm so glad you found us or are joining us once again. And this is the instant tactical reaction. And basically what I want to start with is Arsenal's base in possession, because there were some changes to normal from Mikel Arteta, and the reasons for why are still quite vague. There's the option of how tired I think some of these players' legs are, but I want to get into some of these changes now, because we saw Calafiori, instead of normal going on his sort of marauding left-back role, hunting for gaps and advantages around the base and the pivot of Rice and Zubimendi, Calafiori instead would drop in to create a back three, with Gabriel actually pushing across to the central centre-back zone. He's done this before situationally, but this was much more of a fixed and strict idea from Arteta that, for me, was surprising. Timber was the free right-back, of course, or the free fullback in comparison to Calafiori, whether that was to go and offer high and wide support outside Saka or time these darts through the half space that we're going to get onto. And Eze, his role was probably the most important, because it felt like the game plan, at least for Arsenal tactically, revolved around Eberechi Eze. And we're going to get into how, again, once more we saw him narrow, but for Arsenal it wasn't as much against a stubborn mid-block. It wasn't as much this time about finding this kind of stack of three in the middle that we have against Fulham and Atletico, for example. Instead, we're a bit more flexible in how we tried to create spaces against this Palace mid-block that weren't always successful. And I want to get into some of that today, obviously all of that today. Gyökeres had a very interesting role in terms of exploiting spaces we were trying to create on the right-hand side. And that's what I want to start and get into now, and how that aligns up with this Crystal Palace block. These were our intentions on the ball, and we're going to get into how Crystal Palace themselves sort of how it played in, how we were looking to manipulate their block, because Eze, normally we've seen him drift into these central zones in the middle of that stack and almost be that backboard and play those bounce and wall passes. Today, the license he's found was very different. It wasn't as much vertically, it was about horizontally looking for spaces. And the interesting thing was how we balanced that out. I'm going to give a quick rundown before we delve into it here, because if Eze is on the ball, we can move the ball out of the way. We don't need that here. And if Eze is looking to drop, for example, into these right-back zones, then we would time that with a timber dart between the lines. But sometimes, and most importantly, sometimes Eze would stay deep or stay narrow, and we'd actually vacate this zone, this sort of centre of the pitch, right half space zone. And what we were looking to do was use Eze as this floater, and Guéhi, we would want his positioning we'd want him to try and follow Eze, being the free man, and seeing as though Rice and Zubimendi were doubled up on by Wharton and Kamada, if we could get Guéhi to bite onto Eze, then suddenly you've got, whether that's Saliba, as we'll get onto, or Raya launching a ball into the channel, then all of a sudden, if we clear out the drawings, you've got Gyökeres pulling away, as we did, trying to find this space in behind Guéhi. You've got Saka trying to spin Mitchell, or Timber bursting through. But obviously, this wasn't always successful. And what I want to start on is how this links into what Arsenal were trying to do in the first phase, because we had, especially, well, throughout the match, there was a heck of a lot of possession for Arsenal, bar probably the final 20-25 minutes or so. And that gave us control of the ball, but not necessarily control of the space and the match. But we did get control of the ball, and this was largely how. Palace was set up in this press, and their intentions were Sarr to jump onto Gabriel as their main trigger, Kamada to move on to Zubimendi, and Guéhi potentially, if Eze didn't float all the way into these left-hand side zones, Guéhi would want to meet him, only to a point, not all across the pitch. And then what we were looking to combine that with is Timber making those off-ball runs high, and that would essentially pin Pino here, and it would give Saliba so much time to bring the ball forward for us because Palace were matched up elsewhere and weren't jumping onto him. Calafiori, of course, came and he was an outball from left back, but as soon as we found settled possession, he tucked in. But the option was, once Saliba got the ball, it was to hit Gyökeres. It was to hit Gyökeres long, or for Saka to arrive into these areas. Again, we didn't start with a pocket presence always in here. It was about timing those arrivals into these high right inside zones. Whether that was Timber playing a pass for Saka arriving diagonally, whether that was actually nothing at all and Saliba sweeping that channel hit to Gyökeres. And we'll get on to more of the individuals and Gyökeres' performance specifically in a little while. But these were Arsenal's intentions, and it also felt like Eze was completely at the centre of that. There was less backboarding. There was also a heck of a lot less back to goal stuff. But if Eze could move outside the lines of the block, and then suddenly you've got questions having to answer. Does Guéhi want to follow Eze all the way out here when Mitchell is pinned by Saka? Zubimendi is making those higher off-the-ball runs, pinning Kamada. Mateta is left high. Suddenly, there's a little overload in this corner where Eze, as I know the comments will get on to me for pronouncing his name, he can begin to get onto the ball and actually face the Crystal Palace back line. And in those rare outings that we did have when we made our way into the final third, again, the intentions remain similar. And I think the idea with Calafiori was to allow him to do a little bit more of this. Okay, so starting, in those nominal left centre-back roles. But when we did get into the final third, it was about him leaving the shape, timing his movements, picking his moments to go outside Trossard so he could pinch in, and then Rice of course would balance out to keep the rest defence structure against a Palace side who want to swarm with that sort of cluster of three in Mateta, and it was Nketiah in the second half, but in the first half Sarr and Pino. They want to cluster and get their fullback or wing-back outlets wide and running, with Wharton and Kamada switching instantly to them. It's why they really suit this mentality and this kind of game plan against the bigger sides, and they'll get quite a few giant killings this season and already have. But Calafiori certainly would have been more use in these more settled zones, but we failed to, for the reasons that we sort of spoken about, our intentions not really transpiring as we intended. We didn't get into this situation very often. Again though, in these sort of zones, the right hand side inside spaces, that half space, was left for us to arrive into. Again, it was a deliberate ploy to try and bait Crystal Palace out and to create and then exploit the space for Gyökeres to arc into, for Eze to make those diagonal arrivals in, for Zubimendi to join in, for Timber to make those less purely off ball but more ball hungry runs through the half space, again for Saka to arrive. And that didn't really transpire. I want to, though, quickly speak about Eze and the goal itself, because obviously that was the winner. And I think what's important to note about our set pieces, and there's of course been so much talk about how sustainable they are, I think importantly for the Arsenal set piece discourse, it's about not just having your deliverers and the initial players like Gabriel to meet the cross, but it's having a balance elsewhere. And Eze, for example, if you have a Rice or an Eze as those loose balls, those second plays after the set piece for the drops on the edge of the box, that makes you a balanced threat across the pitch everywhere. And Eze has made a habit, as we know, and as I've sort of scouted in the scouting report so in-depthly, it's about Eze being so good on those loose balls, those bobbles, hitting those first timers that make a set piece side even more inevitable. It's not just about your brilliant deliveries and your sort of first phase attackers. What can you do in the second phases of set piece when you come alive as well? Can you have more arrivals? Can you have Marino arriving? Can you have it bouncing with Rice and Eze on the edge of the area ready to meet it? So that's just a little bit on the goal, because I think set piece analysis can be quite redundant to someone kicks it well, someone heads it in well. But obviously, as we know, almost with the blockers and the intricate routines, there's so much more to that. I want to now look at our press against the Crystal Palace build-up and what sort of Palace's intentions were and how they got out a few times against Arsenal. This was, in effect, our intentions in the press, and you can see how many decisions are being have to made and how difficult Palace make it for you to squeeze, especially as well if they're lumping it up to Mateta all the time and he's competing, you know, for the knockdowns and the balls, and they're swarming in these central areas. But what I want to begin with is our high press, because you have so many decisions on show. Of course, it's not it's very normal to see our striker making those arcs to try and shadow the right centre-back out and press the goalkeeper, and Gyökeres again would make those. But as we've seen with Eze in the right centre-mid instead of Ødegaard, it's been Saka making those jumps on the opposition left centre-back, and Eze has been closer to Kamada. But Kamada made it difficult because he'd drop into these left centre-back zones almost and allow Guéhi to be a bit more central. That jumps Saka out more, and it sort of begins to vacate the centre of the pitch, and that's where Wharton begins to turn on the ball and spread it to Munoz. And there were these decisions all over the pitch, if we readjust here, because of course, as soon as Saka goes on to Guéhi, Timber has to jump, Saliba has to lock on, and you leave Gabriel one-on-one against Mateta. Sorry, not the mic. But more and more what we saw is that it was actually Rice having to bite onto Wharton, with Crystal Palace trying to use this right-hand side of the pitch. Trossard and Calafiori are going to have to tackle Munoz on their own. Gabriel is pinching onto Sarr, who was a real threat dropping into these between-the-line zones. And as settled play began to come into effect for Crystal Palace at the end of that first half, Sarr would be much more on the last line. But him dropping in here meant Gabriel had to sort of choose when to follow him, and of course we saw that leave Saliba in a 1v1 battle with Mateta, and then because we're over on the left hand side of the pitch, Timber's in and able to support more and more. But this was kind of the idea as well against Crystal Palace and what they were trying to do with their ideas, and I think why at times it's not always an Arsenal in possession game, and especially when you have a side full of threat like Crystal Palace do. And I actually think in some regards we were a bit lucky that Wharton's radar, I think, was off today a little bit. But in the meantime, I want to get back and look actually at some of the individual performances, because I actually thought in terms of technically and in terms of security on the ball, Zubimendi arguably actually had his worst game in an Arsenal shirt. But the reason why I say but is that I thought on the second balls he was immense, and it was on a parallel to sort of that Newcastle away performance that Zubimendi gave on the second balls, because there were so many times where he's bit in, whether it's on Mateta or Kamada or Wharton or Sarr, and those dangerous second ball situations that Palace looks to swarm and to flood the box then and run at defences against. Zubimendi controlled those really well, even though he had a less than secure game technically, which is uncharacteristic, of course, for him. I then also want to talk about Viktor Gyökeres, because largely I was happy with him, with the performance in terms of what he gave the team. And if we bring Crystal Palace back in, we can begin to make a bit more sense of this as well, because I spoke about the intentions at the start and trying to draw, let's put a line in there to make it a bit more obvious, trying to draw Guéhi to follow Eze. And if he didn't, then Eze, of course, like we said, can turn and begin to run at the defence like we saw in the first half at times. And if Guéhi can be baited out, it's about Gyökeres making that run. And I think for me and Gyökeres, I think the nuance in terms of how he compares to at Sporting last season is that at the moment the top speed doesn't look quite as top speed, if that makes sense. But what we have to consider is the amount of minutes that this guy has played and the shift that he's still putting in for the team. I think he's making it stick more and more and more. And whether it's Timber hitting the channel early for him or Saliba, as we saw today, the team are getting more cottoned onto those runs that he's trying to make. And with the arrivals that we wanted to kind of create in this high pocket on the right hand side, whether it was Zubimendi or Eze making those diagonal runs, whether it was Timber or Saka, Gyökeres not condensing the pitch and giving that more selfless outlet, that option to stretch a back line is going to help enlarge that and give Eze those pockets to manipulate that he did in the first half, I think almost really, really effectively in terms of goals and assists. And Gyökeres, like I said, I think he's making it stick more, and there's a simplification that's coming with his back-to-goal game as well, which makes, I think, when he comes shorter and he does drop, as if we go back to our base, you can see as I've got the dynamics on screen, he was wanting to make those sort of drops at times as others, whether it be Trossard in the first half, trying to make those outlet runs. And I think there's a simplification coming with his game in these deeper areas where he can now, he's not just thinking about the next action, he's more okay with holding a man and then bumping in someone, often first time. And the relentlessness that Gyökeres did, I think, attend to that Crystal Palace back line with, the amount of runs, even if it didn't stick, I think what we're looking for him to add now is, we know he's got the repeatability. We know he's adding some of the details to his hold-up play in terms of getting those connections with others, adding a bit more deftness. But now, can he, because I think at times when the ball goes in behind, actually we can, if we bring Crystal Palace back in now, we can show it. If Saliba makes those sort of more sweeping balls and hits the channel and Gyökeres arcs here, it's about, we saw how at times Lacroix came across so well against Gyökeres. It's about turning those distances for Gyökeres now, not just holding the ball up and letting those distances close once again, but can you actually, with that space in behind that you've been given, can you enlarge those distances? Can you begin to get shots on goal? Again, something to be wary of is how, we haven't quite seen this yet, but the obvious caveat to that is how many minutes he's playing, and I think how many minutes the team are playing. I think at home against Crystal Palace in the 2-2 draw last season, we looked so leggy, the team, and I think at points we probably did today, and game management comes into it, and that's something we can't forget. But a couple of other individuals I want to speak about is the Hincapié debut, because he came on and played until Lewis Skelly came on and Hincapié moved to a more nominal left centre-back role in a back four. He was playing the same sort of deal that Calafiori found himself in terms of just this left centre-back in a three. And I think actually why it's interesting about bringing Hincapié, not just having his debut and the excitement that comes from that, but in these game states where we're defending a lead in the final 10 or 15 minutes, what's interesting is that he's got that kind of cultural effect on this Arsenal team where he can fly in and win a challenge and sort of galvanise the crowd and get them out of that sort of nervy frame of mind that at times, unsurprisingly, we found ourselves in as Palace was having more of the ball. And that's an interesting cultural effect from Hincapié, away from more of the obvious tactical details of him that we'll see more and more and more as that outside threat from a left back, that ability that none of our left-sided options from fullback have in terms of striking the ball on the move when you're played in behind. And then I also want to talk about, just once again, we've spoken so much on the channel of how Gabriel leads the defensive unit, leaves the line height, the communications when we're in these more backs to a wall, rear guard moments. And how, once again, he felt the centre of attention for that, leading the line height, getting the team up the pitch with him, being the one to win the headers. And in terms of defending a box, how many blocks did he put in again in terms of sweeping on the channel when Calafiori was sort of not out of position, but when Gabriel had to come across and sweep the channel? How many blocks did he make? I've sort of nerded out on the channel, haven't I, so much about the technique of Mosquera as well, and why it's so good to add another serial blocker and sort of someone so attentive to the details of how to block a ball properly, to not turn away, to make yourself big, and to continue keeping that eye contact on the man. So if they do actually fake a shot and change direction, you can adjust accordingly. And Gabriel's probably the best in the world at that. He's the best in the world, arguably, in both boxes. And once again, it was a phenomenal performance for him. And I found it interesting now as we come to the game overall and begin to sum up how this was a game for Arteta and for Arsenal that revolved around, on the ball at least, Eberechi Eze. And like I said, we found that stack that we have been seeing between the lines at times. But it wasn't always about today. It wasn't always about finding your whoever, whether it's Calafiori or Rice, alongside Eze and having Saka or Timber either side of him. Instead, it was about Saka and Timber having that double width on the right hand side and then looking to combine with each other. Again, it was tough. They were often crowded out with Guehi, Pino and Mitchell or Kamada sort of doubling, tripling up on the two. But it was sort of this more, I kind of want to say, lopsided 4-3-3 that Arsenal grew from. And how, if we get rid of the drawings, Eze would be across in sort of almost stacking on top of Zubimendi. And that's just not something that we've seen normally. And if you begin to move Rice into it, it was this lopsided 4-3-3, and Timber and Saka were left to do much of the progression work, with Saliba joining in, again with Timber pinning Pino on the right-hand side. So it was very different, and I think that shouldn't be... We should see how this develops, because, you know, I don't think any of us sitting here want to see Calafiori restrained to a left centre-back berth from Arteta, but there could be so many reasons, fitness-wise, for that. And again, if Hincapié, once again, let's get Hincapié back in there, if he's more fit and you want your left centre-back, or left-back, sorry, to do this tucking-in role, like this, and you want Gabriel to take more and more central centre-back minutes, which isn't ideal, but it's fine, and I think he's grown in stature so much on the ball, of course. But then Hincapié, for this left-back role, is a more obvious fit, and from here he can begin... I realise I've never got a scouting report out on Hincapié, despite sort of doing much groundwork on him, but where he's at his best is sort of blasting channel balls in behind. That's where Martinelli becomes another great out to in runner shot, and Hincapié can do those sort of... he can begin to sit deeper and then pick his moments to move and to stretch the game higher, and he probably suited that role, a fully fit Hincapié, more than Calafiori. But I think that's where we're going to leave it today. And the most important thing is Arsenal have extended their lead to Liverpool to 7 points and to Manchester City too. And that's where, Gunners and Arsenal fans, we're going to leave it today. But I really hope you've enjoyed the tactical analysis as ever. I think it's slightly different intentions on show, and again, it's a reminder that intentions and executions don't always align. But hopefully you can watch this video and you can come away with, okay, it wasn't just a completely drab and uninspiring performance from Arsenal. There were real ideas going on, and we were trying these different things to manipulate a block that, once again, last season has been a kind of thorn in our side, that we've dropped points again. And now we've been on this run of 4 games where we've played sides that we've dropped points against last season, and now we've won every single one. And like I said, there's not an element of scamming the win today. It was a very closely contested match, and once again we didn't give anything away really with Crystal Palace attacks. But if we can begin to fall on these sides of the margins when they're tighter, then that's a definite difference from last season, when it feels like if it was ever a real margins game, we'd slip the wrong side. But that is all today. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll catch you very soon, either tomorrow or Tuesday. See you later.